today's topic is religious freedom and the American Revolution, especially with a little focus on the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, otherwise known as a bill for establishing religious freedom.
Yeah.
And but as I was looking, I was looking at a book by, I don't know whether you've heard of him, Forrest Church.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a he wrote a book called The Separation of Church and State, and he cites some of the major figures in this discussion about freedom of religion, and then he talks about, there's a section on Samuel Adams, and I know you being from Boston and everything else, and I'm going to read a description that he makes of Samuel Adams. At once radical and pious, Adams combined in one person the political libertarianism of John Locke's Enlightenment and the Christian revival spirit of Jonathan Edwards' Great Awakening, together the principal sources for the American revolutionary spirit. And in one other instance, and I have some more to say about Samuel Adams, when he talks about the U.S. motto of E pluribus unum, does that mean it combines some sort of Christian ethics with the Enlightenment philosophy? Is it referring to all kinds of people inhabiting the same land or the same nation or the same state? So I'm going to continue with Samuel Adams. What are your initial thoughts on what we just said?
That's a very prophetic thing that he said about Locke and Edwards and Adams combining them, because you can't really separate out the fact that Adams was a very devout Puritan, and did have a moralistic way of viewing the world that crosses over into his political thing. And he's a member of the church in Boston. One of the really important moments happens in 1774 at the first meeting of the Continental Congress, and most of the people in other colonies thought Massachusetts people are these whacked out Puritans. They're religious fanatics. In fact, that's also what members of Parliament thought. And how will they get along? This is the first time, that they're meeting people from other places. And they're in a place where everyone's not a Congregationalist. And in fact, in Philadelphia, not only, Philadelphia had been started by Quakers, but now there are Presbyterians, there are Baptists, and there's even a Catholic church. The only place, I think, in the British Empire, aside from Quebec, where you can have a Catholic mass. And John Adams goes to all of these places and is really astonished. And the meeting opens, and traditionally you'd open a legislative meeting with a prayer. And everyone looks to the Massachusetts delegation, knowing they think everyone else is a heretic other than us, even though they're all Christians, but they have very different ideas about what that means and about what is the true faith. And everyone looks over at the Massachusetts delegation, are they going to force us to listen to some Congregationalist? And Samuel Adams says, I think that is a good idea. And I understand that the Reverend Jacob Duché is a very good preacher. And Duché is not only not a Congregationalist, he's an Anglican. He's a member of the Church of England. So here is Samuel Adams asking that we open this session of the first ever Continental Congress with a prayer by an Anglican clergyman. And the Reverend Duché does come in, and then every day they have a different one. And this is, to them, this is a marvel. It's a marvel of ecumenicalism. Another thing happens during this meeting, too. These guys, the Massachusetts really wants the other states, provinces to go along with them in this. And the provincial Congress had sent these five guys, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Thomas Cushing, and Robert Treat Paine down to be their delegation to this meeting. And another guy from Massachusetts shows up too, the Reverend Isaac Backus. Backus is from Middleborough, Massachusetts. He's a Baptist minister. Mm-hmm. And he wants to know, how come the provincial Congress that sent these guys and are upset about taxation without representation is taxing his congregation, his Baptists, to support the Congregational church in their town they don't go to. And, the members of Congress, the leaders of Congress think, well, that's a legitimate point. And so the Massachusetts guys don't want to meet with the Reverend Backus because they think the Baptists are a bunch of cranks. And they do. The Congress says, no, we have to meet together to resolve this. And not only that, Congress invites Bacchus to lead them in prayer one day. To the Massachusetts guys, this is horrifying, but then they do have a meeting with Bacchus and these 5 Congregationalists. Remember, the entire Massachusetts Provincial Congress are Congregationalists. And one of them, Robert Treat Paine, says to Bacchus, it's not really a matter of principle with you. You Baptists don't want to pay taxes. And Bacchus says, well, that's exactly what the British Parliament says about you. And then and then he says, why don't you pay taxes to support King's Chapel, which is the Anglican church in Boston? And they say, that's ridiculous because we don't go to King's Chapel. And Bacchus says, my congregation doesn't go to the Congregational church. And you look like you're about to ask something, Anouar.
And doesn't Bacchus go to jail for not paying taxes?
He had gone to jail for not paying taxes. Yeah. And there are other stories of Baptists in Virginia being horsewhipped for preaching. So the Congress tells the Massachusetts guys, when you get back to Boston, you really have to have your assembly do something to relieve the Baptists. And he gets back to Massachusetts and he goes to see the provincial Congress, and they say, oh, no, we're not the assembly. We're the provincial Congress. You have to wait till the assembly's back in session. So they dodge it. It's in fact not until 1820 that Massachusetts stops assessing people taxes to support the Congregational church.
Well. So let's go back again to Samuel Adams. I want to say some more about him. So I was stunned because I was under the impression that a lot of the language in the Declaration of Independence was derived from Thomas Paine's writings and so on. But I'm looking at the Samuel Adams's report that he submitted, like you said, to the Boston town meeting in 1772, and it's called I don't know what the title is, but it was one of the documents he submitted. Yeah. And one of them begins with, among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, a right to life; second, to liberty; third, to property, together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. And later on he says, just and true liberty, equal and impartial liberty in matters spiritual and temporal, is a thing that all men are clearly entitled to by the eternal and immutable laws of God. So this is language that the Declaration echoes this kind of language.
It really does.
I was surprised to know, because I was under the impression that Tom Paine's language ended up in the Declaration of Independence.
Some of it might, but you're right. This is really resting on something else, and is the laws of nature and of nature's God. And framing it in that way, just seeing this, and again, the idea is we have these natural rights because they are given to us by God. That is, that so you're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that is much different than simply saying they come from somewhere. So there is this recognition of that. I don't think it's at odds with what Locke was saying, or what Edwards was saying. And by the way, that report, they're also saying how these British policies violate our rights as Christians, as men, and as subjects. So that's a very important piece of this. Of course, Paine has a much different view of things, and Paine is going to write a tract really attacking Christianity or the Christian doctrine, in a way similar to what Jefferson will do, seeing that there are a lot of accretions to it, and Jefferson wants to get back to what Jesus actually said. But the Declaration really rests on this idea of natural rights being something that comes to us, and we're not in a state of nature, but there is a state of creation. And so, and by the way, they're also writing this, whatever Jefferson's views are, he is writing this as something that is going to be, is going to draw people together. That he's not writing something that's going to be a radical doctrine. People are going to say, wait a minute, I'm not going to go that far. So they're really resting on that idea. And so one of the really interesting things when we get to the Virginia Statute is we're recognizing this kind of Christian basis for things, understanding of how the world was created. But then that, which he writes just 2 years after the Declaration, rests on this idea that this is a human right for everybody. And so that's really the radical thing in this. We still, by the way, are having this argument of, is this a Christian nation or isn't it a Christian nation? And we can argue about it all day. These people did understand that there are lots of different forms of religious expression in the world. And the radical thing they do is separate that out from your rights as an individual, your civil rights. They're not dependent on your religious orthodoxy or your opinions.
Would you say there's a difference in philosophy, sort of a slight difference in philosophy between New Englanders, like Sam Adams and others, and Samuel and those from Virginia, like Thomas Jefferson and George Mason, and and of course Thomas Jefferson.
Sure, yeah, yeah.
Well, because they seem to be more inclined. And then now, as I was looking at some of what they said and that I wrote, they seem to be more sort of radical, quote unquote, in terms of religious freedom.
They are.
It sounds as if the New Englanders were a little bit more, more conservative.
You're trying to make it sound a slight difference. It's a huge difference. It's a huge.
Okay, that's a huge difference.
It's one of the reasons that the British Crown, the Parliament, thought these people will never agree with each other, because there is this big difference, and they continue disagreeing about this. In the 18 teens or 20s, Madison in retirement, someone from New England comes to visit him, and a group of proselytizers come by, Methodists or someone, evangelists, and Madison notes that back in the time of the Revolution, New England was this hotbed of religion, and Virginia was not. And he says, now things have changed. And he attributes this to the fact that there's been a disestablishment of religion, and it started in Virginia first. And that actually allowed for the proliferation of religions. Whereas in Massachusetts, they continued to have a religious establishment until 1820. And that really stultified things. And the reason there is finally, as I said, in 1820, Massachusetts disestablishes the Congregational Church. You no longer have to pay taxes to support it. And actually, the motion in the Constitutional Convention in 1820 to do that was made by John Adams, who came to the convention. And the reason that happened is because there was actually a split among the Congregationalists between the ones who have become Unitarians and those who wanted to maintain the old faith. And then there's an argument, who actually owns the church? Is it the congregation who are now Unitarians, or is it the minister who is still a Congregationalist, or vice versa? Sometimes the minister becomes a Congregationalist and the congregation doesn't. And this, by the way, is something that winds up in court. Who actually owns this? It wasn't the court isn't deciding who is right, but who has title to the property. And what the courts usually did was say, okay, one group gets to keep the building, the other can keep the church silver, and they can sell that and build their own meeting house somewhere else.
Which is fascinating. Now, which leads me to think, and whether the American Revolution from the get-go, I mean, at least in the minds of people like Madison and Jefferson, I don't know about Adams, it was associated with, a big component of this revolution is religious freedom, in the ways that Thomas Jefferson and Madison and company understood it. Which is why, before we get to talk about the Virginia statute, it's like, it seems like Thomas Jefferson was insistent on this very, notion of freedom. Just like Thomas Paine was, even though, I mean, just before I forget this, which also struck me recently as I was looking at my notes, like Thomas Jefferson sort of rewrote his Bible, so to speak, when he was older, about 77 years old. And so just like Thomas Paine, waited till the end of his life to write, to do a criticism of religion.
Yeah, and Jefferson is really engaged with this. In fact, he does the moral teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and he goes through the New Testament, takes out everything that is known Jesus said, and that is the basic philosophy, leaving aside, is Jesus the Son of God? These other theological questions which don't interest him. What does interest him is the system of ethics. And he is, in many ways, like Franklin, who is trying to find a useful religion, something, a civic religion that will be useful without saying, if one person starts saying, or one group starts saying, we speak for God, they know the danger in that. When anyone thinks they have a direct line, and that's been one of the tensions, we've had in human history. The Puritans are breaking away from the Church of Rome. Remember, in the Church of Rome, you have this idea that the Pope and the clerical hierarchy are the ones who really interpret this and then can explain it to you. And does that mean they actually are in communication with them? And the thinking has become, no, they actually have these texts that were written down, and that's what we interpret, not that, God just spoke to me and said, this is the way we're going to do things now. They saw the danger in that, and this is why, anyway, Jefferson sees a lot of the religious establishment as being accretions, and really sees the dangers then in having the state, which does wield power, able to coerce people into thinking a certain thing, or saying, well, you think differently than I do, therefore, you're not entitled to, trial by jury, or you have to pay taxes to support my particular creed. And they're trying to get away from all of that. And the safest way to do that, is by disestablishing. But actually, Jefferson, as with Franklin and as with Thomas Paine, are really know the scriptures. They really understand this world, and they're fascinated by this world. Not that they are trying to find divine truth, but they are trying to find an abstract truth. And what is it? And how have different people interpreted it over time? Franklin, at the end of his life, Ezra Stiles, who's a congregational minister and also the president of Yale, is writing to him, wanting him to declare that he knows Jesus is his Savior. A similar thing, by the way, that Franklin's sister is writing to him, and she is quite horrified when she hears rumors that he's become an atheist. And Franklin writes to Dr. Stiles saying, he's now in his late 80s, he's not in very good health. He knows he's dying, and he says, I will know the answer soon enough. So why am I going to worry about it now?
So, I don't know. The question I have about Jefferson, especially about Jefferson, is like, there is this, this narrative that he basically, because of religious factionalism, which George Washington abhorred, was also very wary of this kind of religious factions competing. So it was a practical solution to the various denominations that are vying for influence and rights and privilege. But it seems to me that Thomas Jefferson especially was actually intellectually committed to the notion of religious freedom, more so than a practical solution to the politics.
He definitely is. Just as he's committed to this whole idea of human freedom. I mean, you can't separate this out from Jefferson. And he sees this as really essential to any kind of civil society. And I guess the question for us as historians is to try to figure out why Jefferson. But then, of course, there were other Virginians who share this. Virginia it had an established church, which was the Anglican Church. And going to that was more just a thing you did, as opposed to the Congregationalists are taking notes on the sermons and really trying to understand, what must I do to be saved? And the Anglicans have something of a different idea about this. And Virginia was certainly more welcoming to people of other religious denominations. The Quakers come there when they're kicked out of Philadelphia during the Revolution. Not as hospitable to the Baptists. And the Baptists pose a real challenge to the religious hierarchy in Virginia because they think all souls are equal in the eyes of God. So the rituals of the Anglican Church really they think are an abomination. And the answer isn't let's abolish the Anglican Church, but let's allow different religious denominations to express themselves. And the state shouldn't be in the business of determining which is the true faith.
Yeah. And so what, as you said, Thomas Jefferson, let's stay with Thomas Jefferson.
And I think, by the way, Anouar, there's also another piece to this. This is also part of Jefferson trying to limit the power of the state, to decide on what opinions are right. And you see this when So that is really the essential thing about Jefferson, is trying to limit the power of the state, whether it is the provincial government of Virginia or the British Crown or ultimately the United States, to get into to decide matters of opinion.
Yes, and I think that's why would that be why he considers the Virginia statute one of the three things that
Yeah,
uh, that mattered to him the most,
yeah,
on his, inscribed on his grave,
it is.
basically.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
The Declaration,
yeah.
Virginia statute, and the University of Virginia, not the
Yeah.
presidency.
No, 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 no. Well, yeah, and it really is. It really is the thing that I think one of the things that makes the American Revolution so different from other revolutions. It's the setting in motion this idea, which Jefferson writes that he revises the entire Virginia legal code in the late 1770s. Again, he was really a very detail oriented as well as a very good lawyer, a really elite student of the law. So he does change the whole Virginia legal code, eliminating a lot of capital crimes. But then the Virginia statute doesn't pass.
Yes,
The Anglican clergy, the now Episcopal clergy in Virginia, don't want to give up the fact that taxes are supporting their churches, and the worry what happens when we're no longer supported by taxes. And there had been, the issue. Patrick Henry makes this case in the 1760s, the Parsons cause, where complicated case, ministers are paid by tobacco, but the price of tobacco is set. So what happens if the price of tobacco falls? Well, they want more money, or if it rises, then people say, "Wait a minute, we're paying these guys too much," and that was kind of the big cause. And Henry uses it as an attack on these venal, corrupt ministers who would steal from the widow her last blanket, her last milk cow. Jefferson uses it really as an attack on the whole idea that the state should be engaged in this kind of thing. As he says in the notes of Virginia, if my neighbor believes there is no God or there are 20 gods, it neither breaks my leg nor picks my pocket.
that's right. And also the significance of the statute is when it passed in 1786, right? No, 1786 it did. Yeah,
Yeah,
because it was drafted in 1779.
yeah, yeah,
And he was a minister in France, and he wrote a letter to John Wythe
yeah.
in
With,
August of 1786. He says, "Our act for freedom of religion is extremely applauded." And he goes on, "The ambassadors and ministers of the several nations of Europe resident at this court have asked of me copies of it to send to their sovereigns, and it is and it is inserted at full length in several books
yeah,
now in the press." So it had a huge resounding effect in
yeah,
Europe, right? And yet the Virginia statute it's still not well known today for some reason. Declaration far,
yeah, yeah,
I don't, at least worldwide. I'm not
yeah.
talking about
Okay,
in the United States.
okay, yeah. Maybe you're right. It is a radical thing. He even sends a copy to the Pope, and he's proud of the fact that one draft had said that it's thanks to the holy author of our religion, and that was taken out because it thought that's too much, saying this is a Christian thing. And Jefferson said this shows that this is meant not just for Christians, but for the Jew and the Gentile, the Mahometan and the Papist, and the infidel, and the Hindu and the infidel of all descriptions. So,
That's right.
and it's really an astonishing thing. And you think about now where Europe does have, many countries have established churches, but they're empty. And there's
That's
been a
right.
real growth in Islamic populations in Europe. And there's a kind of certain, we don't need to get into contemporary European politics right now, but keeping the state out of this is,
Yes.
Jefferson thinks, one way of avoiding these kinds of calamities, and making sure the state doesn't have a role in this. And Jefferson, by the way, you said he's in France, so he wasn't able to get it through the legislature. The person who really
Yes.
does is Madison, and over the opposition of Patrick Henry. And Henry has this other idea. How about, because again, the clergy worry, what happens if we're not being supported by taxes? And so Henry has essentially a checkoff system where you can check off what denomination you want your taxes to go to. And that seems like a good compromise. That way the Baptists won't be paying to support the Anglicans. And Madison says, no, it's not the business of the state to know. where you want to make donations, or
Hmm.
to get in the realm of being the civil magistrate should not be in a position of determining this. So that is really Madison is really the legislative leader who gets this through. And of course, his cousin is an Anglican bishop in Virginia, and the same name, by the way, James Madison. James Madison, the bishop, James Madison, the president. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, they do see this as the profound thing. Why it's not better known, I can't tell you. I think it really, definitely think it should be. Jefferson certainly thought it should be. He even sends a copy to the Pope.
Oh, that's interesting that he sent it to the Pope because at least George Washington seems to be very um, he extended that same spirit to Catholics and to
Yeah.
Jews
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
and he does mention Mohammedans and Muslims.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, Muslims get mentioned here and there
Yeah.
as part of the nation, as part of
That's right.
this
Yeah. Yeah.
citizenry,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
part of the makeup of the new nation. So even though they must have been, except for as you know, the slaves, people who
Yeah.
had been
That's right.
enslaved,
Yeah.
it's very rare to find that there are not many Muslims in the United States at that
No, there
time.
aren't.
I mean,
No, there aren't. Yeah. But there's
but
always this
that
idea,
kind of
there may be,
spirit,
yeah.
yes.
There's this delegation. Salim is the guy who, Jefferson knew him in Williamsburg in the 1760s, and then in the mid 1780s, this delegation comes, and they don't speak English, and their documents are all in a language no one can understand, and they're thinking maybe they're spies sent by the Dey of Algiers, and
Yeah. Yes.
it's more likely they were actually Jews who were coming. But there's this certainly an idea we're part of this bigger world. And when the first American warship goes to Turkey in 1800, they see this thing. Okay, you have stars on your flag. We have a star and a moon. We have a moon on our flag. This means we have the celestial relationship. Um, and the treaties with Tripoli and Algiers all say that that it's not a Christian nation, and we're making trading arrangements with other nations. So that's again, it's a somewhat complicated story that we're telling here, both about the political impact of all of this, as well as then what this does to people of deep religious faith.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you mentioned the Treaty of Tripoli. It was mentioned by I think President Obama,
Hmm.
because in one of when I was looking at it,
Yeah,
as an example of trying to reach out to
yeah,
Muslims in his when he was president. Anyway, yeah. I mean, I read an article, a brief one by James Hudson, documenting
yeah.
the number of times sort of who had mentioned Muslims in this kind of extending the same freedoms to Muslims during the
Hmm.
American Revolution and in conceiving of the new nation. I mean, George Washington is a great example of such founders who had no animus towards any of the
Yeah,
religions that
yeah,
he was talking
yeah,
to. Most famously, Catholic, especially the Jews in Rhode Island and
right.
so
Yeah,
on,
yeah, yeah.
that kind of thing.
Okay.
And so the question, I mean, I remember because we could go through the statute, which is fascinating. Some sentences, some passages. But I remember, like when after the Gulf War, the uh, the Bush administration sent Noah Feldman. Noah Feldman, another great scholar of
Yeah,
religion.
yeah.
He's they dispatched him to Iraq and Afghanistan, especially Iraq, to help them craft a new constitution.
Mhm.
And he eventually gave up. He said they're not going to accept the notion of this kind of religious diversity. Like the
Hmm.
president has
Yeah,
to be Muslim.
yeah, yeah,
There's no question about that.
yeah.
So it's still extremely, to me, when I look at the revolution and this kind of language, this kind of philosophy, it's still revolutionary
It
from
is. It
what I'm
really
seeing now.
is. It really is. In a lot of parts of the world, um, and even at the time, the Massachusetts Constitution does require the governor to be a professing Christian,
Mhm.
and in Connecticut, the governor had to profess a belief in the Trinity. And these are things that change not because of enlightenment, just because of religious diversity that they changed. And there was this. So I don't know what the solution is in other places, but I think it starts with disestablishing any religion and saying that you're, as the statute says, that a person's civil rights don't have any bearing, any connection to his ideas in religion any more than in mathematics or anything else. Um, and it's also then a sign of respect. That is, the First Amendment, which really does in many ways derive from the Virginia statute and from Madison's understanding of it. And Madison knew the Virginia Constitution of 1776 also allows for religious freedom. That is, you won't be harmed in your ways of worship. But then he knew that Virginia was taxing Baptists and others to support a church they didn't belong to. So how can you say we have religious freedom when we're still taxing people? Which is why Madison really gets the Virginia statute through. And then the First Amendment has the two clauses. One is an establishment of religion, and the other is abridging the free exercise of religion. It's a little less striking than the Virginia statute, but at the time, of course, some states did have this. And the Constitution also says there will be no religious test for anyone who holds an office under the United States. And that's really a radical idea. As Noah Feldman found, you can't do that in Afghanistan or Iraq, say no religious test, you have to be a Muslim. And that was actually proposed by a guy from South Carolina at the convention, and there was absolutely no debate on it. And in Massachusetts, when the Constitution is up for ratification and people are debating it, this was actually one of the charges against it, is that anyone, even a Muslim or a Catholic, they say Mohammedan or Papist, could be president under this. As they understood that could happen. And
Yeah. And even though, as you well know from the work you've done, the excellent work you've done, is that the many members of the revolutionary generation had a negative view of Islam. Many of them saw Islam as tyrannical, as they associate with despotism and the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. So Thomas Jefferson himself translated some books by French scholars on the issue, and so that is even more amazing to know that they had, there was Islamic Muslim nations, except for occasionally somebody would say, like Benjamin Franklin or Ezra Stiles would say that the Islam is, in some cases, Islam is better than what we do here in the United States. Muslims do better in terms of to the treatment of slaves, or as you well know, in your book. But on the whole, there was a negative view of Islam, and yet they included them in the polity they are making as equal members in this nation, in this new state that they're creating.
Yeah, that is one of the things that always really challenges us. Why did they do that? When I think if we were doing it, we probably wouldn't. And so it's much more expansive. And seeing an open possibility in many cases, not in all cases, that I mentioned some of the state constitutions, which do require practicing Christian. And by the way, they are overwhelmingly Protestant too, and have deep animus toward Catholics, and in Pennsylvania toward Quakers, for a variety of reasons. And so that is really one of the things that makes the revolution such an earth-shattering event, is because they do take these steps that we wouldn't expect of them, probably because we wouldn't expect them of us. And so opening this up, even though they have this distrust, again, they're getting their view of Islam through, Voltaire and others who have written about the religion. And Voltaire, when he's writing about Islam, is really writing about the French religious establishment. And so he's against the Catholic Church's power in France. He can't really say, hey, the Catholic Church has too much power. So you write about this religious tyranny that happens somewhere else. And the Abbé Volney is also a French philosopher who writes this. He travels through Mesopotamia, Syria, and he wonders how come these places that once had flourishing civilizations now are these howling deserts, and thinks, well, it's because they have this religious tyranny. And that's the thing. And he writes the book called The Ruins, which Jefferson, when he's president, is translating. There's already an English translation of this, but he thinks this is such an important thing, not because it says, hey, Islam is bad. It's this idea of the state using its coercive power to force people to believe something is what is going to lead to this.
Yes, absolutely. And even though George Washington had, I think he inaugurated the the national praise of
Yeah,
Thanksgiving,
yeah.
and so he had that little. He had a little. He believed in some value of that Christian had some value in the republic. I mean,
Hmm.
maybe he was associated with virtue or the
Yeah, yeah,
cultivation of virtue and so on. So, but at the same time, he was utterly open to the other religions,
yeah,
and he
yeah,
was
yeah.
talking to them and he was inviting them, assuring them of their rights and privileges in
Hmm.
the new nation.
Hmm.
So now the question I would have is if this were to be done in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, would it still be possible to do the same thing that the founders did in the late 18th century?
That's a very good question. Early 2100, 2000s. I
Oh,
don't.
2100. Okay.
I honestly don't think so, because I think they lived in a world where there was this enlightenment value, that um, this idea of a progress. Today, I think we look at progress and we think we pretty much know everything and have achieved it. They had this element of doubt, and the questioning of things, and knowing we don't have all of the answers. So we have to leave the next generations free to devise this. Jefferson's always writing about monkish superstition. That is, they understood what had happened, in a period when the church and the state were working in collaboration, essentially to suppress not only people's material quests, but their spiritual quests. And then they came. Many of the founders here came out of a religious dissenting tradition, like Franklin and others. And this is a history that weighed very much on them. The idea that the state and the church, or the religious powers, will work together, and they are reacting against that, and they're trying to avoid that. One of the interesting little pieces I found in the course of writing my first book was this little newspaper squib from like sometime around 1800. And one thing talks about, a little notice: Robert Fulton has returned to the United States, and he's this great craftsman, mechanic, and does all kinds of interesting things. And the other one talks about there are like 7 rivers in, it was either Algiers or Morocco, and I apologize for getting them confused. And there are no
Well,
bridges over them.
big difference.
I know there's a big difference. It must be Algiers, because they hadn't built any bridges over any of these rivers, and there are no printing presses.
Yes.
So it's a mark of the difference in these societies. And it's not because these people are Muslim; it's because they have this government religion working together to prevent any kind of enterprise or any kind of spark that here we have. And that's really the critical thing that people like Jefferson are thinking about, is how do we avoid that? And, one way the French find to avoid that is simply to abolish all religion, and instead institute the goddess of reason, and crown her in Notre Dame Cathedral, and institute this new idea. And that, to most of these people, is almost as bad. You're simply saying, no, it's something that surprised David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher. When he goes to Paris, he was a skeptic, a great religious skeptic, and he goes to Paris, and they're not skeptics, they're atheists. That is, they know.
Yes.
They know there's no God. And Hume says, well, I don't know that there is. How can I know that there isn't? And I think the Americans tend more toward the Hume side than the Voltaire side.
Yes.
Although I have to say, in defense of Voltaire, when Franklin presents his grandson to Voltaire and asks him to bless him, imagine this: Benjamin Franklin, great American freethinker; Voltaire, the world's leading atheist, and Franklin asks for a blessing. And Voltaire puts his hands on Temple Franklin's head and says, in English, "God and liberty." And he writes, what else could one say for a grandchild of a Franklin? And by the way, the audience, the French folks who had gathered for this great meeting between Franklin and Voltaire, are shocked because Voltaire's speaking in English and they can't understand him.
No, that's amazing. So, I mean, the thing is, the revolution happened because the founders, the people behind it, were profoundly influenced by the philosophy of the Enlightenment, and that we no longer live in the age of the. At some point in American history, we stopped living in the age of the
I
Enlightenment.
think you're right.
And-
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I don't know when that is.
Okay.
But yeah, but it's not that we realize we're in the dark ages. We believe we're in an enlightened age, but we have trouble really seeing anything that's beyond our nose. So that's you're more of a philosopher than I am, so we can piece this
No,
out
no.
later.
I mean, it's one because recently I've been reading some books about the failure, the collapse of liberalism.
Hmm.
Patrick Deneen. I reviewed a
Yeah,
couple of his books and I
yeah,
interviewed him, and people like him. I read about 3 books on the subject. There is this kind of nostalgia for the major problem with the West right now apparently is we lost religion,
yeah,
and so it is that kind of tension that is inherent in the American Revolution. It's like lip service. You give lip service to a broad kind of like broad notion of Christianity, which doesn't have a lot of. There's no without the fervor that's usually
yeah,
associated with
yeah,
religion, and which kind of eventually led to, which is basically a secular revolution in so
yeah,
many ways
yeah.
because
I
of the
think yeah.
Enlightenment. And now there's a nostalgia, whether it's probably false nostalgia, because the founders knew exactly what they were making, what kind
Hmm.
of nation they were putting together. So
Yeah,
there is this notion of we're a Christian nation, somebody would say that, especially members on the right now. I
yeah,
mean, a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
people in the
yeah.
conservative movement, but I don't know what they don't seem to exclude non-Muslims. They just are proud to announce that they are Christians.
Yeah, it's really a curious time. And you see most Christian churches, they've taken away any trappings that would identify this place as a church.
Mhm.
And it's, I could give examples. The kind of flags you'll see out them are announcing their fealty to different current social movements, as opposed to this central idea that is part of the faith, and it's about getting back to the dignity of all people. People are created in the image of God, and that idea, central idea here. Um, and every year when our dean asks us to tell her about what we're doing to promote diversity, I always say that my faith tells me to treat every person as I would want to be treated, and that's kind of the idea the framers were working on. And so having a state that will do that but not treat one person better because his religious philosophy happens to agree with mine, and also not knowing which of the two of us is going to heaven. I mean, that's a mystery. And it's really, as Franklin said, it's really a mystery we'll find out soon enough. So and Jefferson says this in his first inaugural address, talking about this over the providence has shown this favor, and really values most the happiness of man here and hereafter. That is kind of the idea for these guys, seeing that this is really the working out of providence. If you want to take Jefferson as having some religious faith at all, that and Franklin spends a lot of his childhood reading his father's library, which is mainly polemic theology, and he comes away from this basically finding better arguments against this. But then he comes up with his own religious idea, his own religious scheme, which he wants to call the Society of the Free and Easy. But he has 13 virtues that he is trying to inculcate. I think we've gotten into an age where we see any idea of virtue as being kind of anathema, or is it rooted in Christianity, therefore it has to be discarded. That's part of the age we live in, and simply professing that we are a Christian nation. I don't know. I don't think that we are, but I do think that these the secular values we have really are part of what had been this Christian ethic, which I think is what Jefferson was getting at in his moral teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, that Franklin was getting at, as opposed to, we want you to go to the Anglican church or the Congregational church and hear a sermon on this. We want you to live virtuous lives.
Well, what I'm hearing is basically today people are responding to what's happening in the present. The breaking news is always breaking news.
Yeah,
There's very little knowledge of history.
yeah,
And I think that's what we are losing. And we live in the age of information, but we have completely abandoned the quest for knowledge,
yes, yeah,
which is what you do brilliantly.
yeah, yeah,
Historical work. And the other day, just not long ago, was when I was in Maine. Actually, I wanted to read a book about the Magna Carta,
hmm,
and I was stunned about how many of the ideas that eventually found their way to the American Revolution or the constitutions, whatever. Basically, there is a lineage there. You could see the connection to the
yeah,
Magna Carta,
yeah,
which
yeah,
is
yeah,
a fascinating connection, even though, but just you could see it in embryonic fashion that
yeah,
the
yeah,
some notions that are about rights
yeah,
and they begin. There is an archaeology or genealogy of knowledge that is completely lost now,
it
and
definitely is.
so
Yeah,
I wanted to, I couldn't resist. I was thinking of the movie Goodfellas when somebody asks you about diversity.
mm,
In the movie, there was they were playing a heist in an airport in New York, and they were talking to a guy who works there, and they asked him, how about security? And the guy is a security works in security at the airport. He said, so you're looking at it.
yeah, 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 yeah,
So
yeah,
if somebody says, ask you about diversity, say, you're looking at it.
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, and this is something that I think Madison and other framers understood, that we're all different and we all
Yeah.
have different ideas. And so, and Madison understood this, which is why he is so brilliant, understanding that there are some areas in which we disagree and some in which we disagree. And people have different interests, but all kinds of different interests. I think you have in the 19th century, you developed the more Marxian idea that we respond simply to economic motives, and that's it. And culture is really the superstructure. And Madison and the framers would have disagreed with that. And certainly the evangelical movement disagrees with that. And we have, I don't know how many great awakenings there have been in the history of the United States or the American Republic. And I think we might be in one now. And at the same time, we can also look at the rise of fundamentalist movements in Islam in the same, sometimes at the same period. The one that brings a lot of enslaved people to the Americas from West Africa, which is why there are Muslims enslaved in America, is because of these religious wars going on in West Africa. And I think by simply looking at economic motives, we lose track of that. And by the way, I'm also struck looking at the iconography of the revolution, how often Magna Carta is part of it. And they definitely understood this history. They also understood the history of 16th and 17th century England, and also understood as much as they could the histories of other places, which is why you see books on, the Ottoman Empire, or on Morocco, or on Sweden, or the Dutch
Yes.
Republic.
Yeah, Jefferson's collection alone. And I remember, I'm thinking as I was reading, going through my notes again, somebody was complaining. He gave his books to Congress to
Yeah.
become the library, and somebody complained about how could you accept books from a atheist and
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
But he was so open minded. I mean, it's incredible. What a phenomenon! I think and maybe I have mentioned it before. If I could identify one person to embody the spirit of the Enlightenment, it would have to be Jefferson. I mean,
Okay.
it's more so than Benjamin Franklin or
Why is
George
that?
Washington.
Why more so than Franklin?
Intellectually, because Thomas Jefferson was the kind of he is the sort of philosopher of the revolution. Benjamin Franklin is the level-headed, statesman.
Okay, yeah, okay, fair enough. I think you may be right. And you never quite know when Franklin is serious or when he is.
Yes.
It's a joke we don't quite understand.
Yes. Again, well, I was going to say another joke about the mafia. What happens when the mafia meets Jacques Derrida or deconstructionist? An offer you can't understand.
Yeah. the first line in The Godfather is, "I believe in America." Yeah,
Yes.
but that's right. The offer you can't understand.
Well, I think this. No, thank you so much. This is fascinating. The notion of freedom. This is why the American Revolution matters to me most, because I think it has practical value and a huge lesson to some parts of the world that still haven't absorbed the principles and the vision of the American Revolution, which is now being diluted from the mother country, the United States, diluted by other forms of politics, other ways of thinking, that people completely have. You know what? It amazes me that people know nothing. I mean, I was in a conference after the Arab Spring in Fordham's Law School in New York with a bunch of Arab people from the different countries, to talk about constitutions, because after the Arab Spring, everybody was writing a new constitution. And nobody had heard of the Virginia Statute, and nobody had studied the making of the American Constitution and what it implies. They all went to law schools, read these very abstract, jargon-laden, documents and so on. But nobody. I mean, how could you study? How could you write a constitution and not know the history of the first constitution of the modern world?
I know. Yeah.
And anyway, you have to. And I mentioned the Virginia Statute, and I get a lot of people angry.
Wow. That's fascinating and troubling. But and it also explains why the Arab Spring turned out the way it has. I think.
Yes. There's so much to talk about, Bob, and I'm so happy to see you. And we'll keep talking about the American Revolution, and I hope the weather is nice in Boston. I don't know; it's spring here now.
Oh, that's nice. Very nice. Very nice. It is. I know spring in Boston, spring in Tangier mean different things. So
yes. Thank you so much, Bob.
Good to see you, Anouar. Take care.
Good to see you.
Take care.